This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting off the show is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This time they talk about habitats and structures in ponds. Brian Olson, head of K-State's Western Kansas Research Extension Centers, and Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, K-State soil fertility specialist, keep the show going by discussing a crop production management practices project they'll be working on that has recently received millions in funding. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk rounds out today's show by explaining the discomfort udder edema causes and how dairy farmers can reduce the incidence of it on their farms. That and more is coming up ahead. This is Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. Joe, I think this episode we're going to talk a little bit about pond management. So what are you thinking about hitting on today?
I thought we'd jump in and talk a little bit about habitat in ponds. So what is habitat? Is that the same as structure? And why do we need to be thinking about that?
So, Joe, what is habitat?
Well, I like to start out with the official definition. So I did a quick Google search. Merriam-Webster Dictionary says it's a place or environment where a plant or animal naturally and normally lives and grows. So talking about habitat, we tend to think of it generally as kind of like our house, right? And so a lot of people think of the structure or where the animal is as the habitat, but it's more in depth than that. So the habitat needs to make sure that it is that shelter, that protection. That's a really important component. We also need to make sure there are other things like areas that they can go feed. These animals can go feed or they can go reproduce. So a habitat needs to be, it's a broader definition than just the area that animal is living at, to me at least.
So what kinds of things can provide structure for critters?
So a lot of times people say, I'm going to add this tree as habitat. That tree is really the structure. And again, all the things that tree helps to support them would be the habitat. So the objects that we're placing in the water, those are the structure. And I'm going to use those terms probably interchangeably, but understanding that structure is what's there. Habitat's kind of what we're fostering.
Are different kinds of structures important for different species?
Definitely, and even within a species, different age classes. And so, one of the things we need to make sure we're doing is that we're having a variety of different types of structure, creating different types of habitat in our system. And so, in general, smaller fish, the prey items that we have, or the prey fish we have, are going to be in shallower habitats. We tend to think of bigger fish being in deeper habitats, and it's not that simple. I want to make sure that's clear, but making sure when we're making these different structure piles or habitats in a pond that we're including those deep habitats all the way up to the shallows. I like there to be some sort of structure even in water that's 2 inches deep. I like, branches to be sticking out of the water a little bit. And from an ecology standpoint and thinking about the fish in that pond and the critters in the pond, having things that are sticking out of the water all the way down to, deeper 8, 10, 12 feet of water is really important. So we need to make sure that we have that variety of habitat. We need to also make sure we're thinking about, what do these critters need in different times of the year. And so, they're going to need deeper water where the water's warmer actually in the really cold months. So there might be ice on top, but that deep water is going to be the warmest water. So that's going to be important. We also need to make sure they have habitat for reproduction, and so there's going to be some certain criteria there. Sunfish are going to require something a little bit different than bass, for example. So, thinking through all those different things, having a variety of habitat, making a plan is really important for what we're doing.
You talked a little bit about putting things out there. Are we always going to put something out there, or are there going to be naturally occurring cover types as well?
Yeah, so, a lot of the ponds that we're looking at have been man-made, so we're having excavators out there and digging a hole in the ground, and most of the time in those cases we're going to have to add something to that structure. There are other ponds where we've dammed up a river or a stream, and that's created some flooded area where there's already some natural types of structure and habitat. So each pond is going to vary. If you already have some natural trees and natural rock piles in your pond that's created, that's fantastic. Most of the ponds that I'm interacting with are man-made, and so we need to be thinking about adding something to those those ponds that have been created. The structure kind of falls into two different groups, Drew, and so one of them is natural types of structure that's already can be found in the environment. So trees, branches, rocks, gravel are kind of the big groups there. And there is some artificial structure. A lot of people have made structures, or you can go buy commercially available structures, and there's some benefit to both of those. So, one of the easy areas to start are trees by your pond or your landscape. And so when we're thinking about trees, we need to think about, are they deciduous trees or are they conifers? Are they hardwood trees like an elm tree that might be growing near your pond, or is it a cedar tree that's growing around there? And the reason that's really important is the amount of time that it takes for those different types of trees to break down. So having a good variety of the types of trees that we're adding to our pond is important for making sure, again, that we have habitat for the small fish and for the bigger predator fish as well.
What about rocks?
A lot of predators really like rocks. Big rock piles tend to be, we're thinking about boulders. So a rock that maybe you could pick up, but you're going to struggle, to something that, might be bigger than you or me. And so there's a lot of value in piling these up. 1 to 3 kind of yards is what they're averaging, so about a ton of rocks in a general area, just piled up in a mound. A lot of invertebrates like these rocks. Crayfish, if you have those in your pond, would really like these areas. And because of all of that, those invertebrates being there, that tends to attract some fish to these habitats as well. And so big boulder areas, rock piles can be very beneficial, especially for those bigger fish. Also having, in some shallower habitats, especially having some gravel. And so gravel tends to just be smaller rocks. Adding it in the shallower habitats, 3 feet to 5 feet deep, is kind of the recommendation. And we want to make sure that we're adding that somewhere in the 3 to 5 inches deep. So that 3 to 5 feet, 3 to 5 inches is kind of a good rule of thumb to follow. The real benefit of the gravel is that a lot of the sunfish or bluegill that we have in a lot of our ponds like to use gravel beds for spawning. And so in the spring months, you might walk down your gravel and see a lot of almost perfect circles that are made in that gravel bed, and that's from a lot of these sunfish that are reproducing, using those gravel beds to reproduce. So having big rocks, little rocks, definitely beneficial to your pond. We're generally aiming for somewhere between 10 and 20% coverage for structure or habitat in our pond. That's kind of a good target to reach for. If we start to get above that number, it's not necessarily bad, but it makes it harder to do things like go fish and target fish. The fish are going to be spread out a lot more. So figuring out kind of, hey, where can I go catch dinner tonight or go have a good fun time fishing in an afternoon gets to be a lot harder if we put structure everywhere. So kind of having a good balance there is important.
What about natural vegetation? I know one of the things you deal with a lot is people who feel like they've got too much vegetation and want to kill that stuff. What role does natural vegetation play for fish habitat? That's
one of the best habitats that we can have, and so encouraging natural vegetation in the right amounts is really beneficial. Natural vegetation supports some of the biggest fish that you'll see in a pond. It also supports some of the smallest, so it's a good area for predators and prey fish to kind of both intermingle. Like you said, making sure that it's under control, that it's not invasive vegetation, and that it's not covering more than 10 or 20% of your pond is definitely something you want to be aware of. It's really, really good habitat for a variety of fish. Almost every fish will utilize natural vegetation. One of the downsides, it can be hard to fish, right? And so figuring out how to use some weedless soft plastics or something like that in those areas would be beneficial. But it's really good from a pond standpoint. Definitely something we want to have in the right amounts.
So when we're thinking about getting this structure out there, how much of this do you need to plan ahead for when you're either building or rehabbing a pond? And how much can you put out there after the pond has water and fish in it already?
The easiest way to have structure in a pond is to put it out there during construction. But a lot of us already have ponds, or a lot of our listeners, I guess, already have ponds. And so you can definitely add more structure to your pond. You want to make sure that you have that plan so you're not adding too much structure. But you can add it. One of the ways I like to add it is, wait till the winter time. Up in Kansas, where we're at, we get nice ice coverage, and so you can take something out on that ice and set it there when it's nice and cold, and then as it warms up, that ice melts and it will break through that ice and settle down to the bottom. It's a good way to do it. If you're going to do that, make sure you spend a little time making sure that ice is safe to walk out on before you go out there. So a good 4-inch thick ice is kind of the recommendation before we're going out and actively spending time on that ice. If you're going to drive a side-by-side or something like that out there with the structure on it, we want to make sure we're closer to that 6 or 7 inches thick of ice. And so, but that's a good time, middle of winter, if it gets cold enough to go add some structure. There are other things you can do. You can hinge cut trees that might be right near the bank and let those fall in. So, it kind of depends on what opportunities you have, but we can always add structure to a pond after it's been built.
What about anchoring our structures and those sorts of things? Do we want to keep them put, or do we want to let them move around? Or
So generally we want to know where they're at, right? And so we want to, a lot of this comes back to fishing. We want to make sure that we know we can go to an area and the fish will be there, or some of these structures have to be piled up in order for them to provide good benefits. And so it's always a good idea to anchor your structure. It's as simple as, a little bit of cable and a cinder block most of the time, and running that around a few of your trees or tree branches and kind of dumping it in an area. Having some good anchors is really important. When I talk about anchors, a lot of people tend to bring up tires. They want to know if they can use tires as anchors or tires as structure in a pond. That's generally not advisable, and so they're around a lot, but they tend to break down, and a lot of them can release some harmful chemicals into the pond. I've seen it cause some pretty significant water quality issues, and so I generally don't recommend tires. There's lots of other things that we can find before we're adding them to a pond. So if you want to anchor them down, if you can anchor them to a big boulder or a cheap cinder block, that's kind of what we recommend.
Well, that's all for this episode, and we'll catch everybody next time.
Once again, that was Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and you can listen to the full episode or past episodes on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show discussing about a crop production management practices project that is being worked on by the head of K-State's Western Kansas Research Extension Centers, Brian Olson, and K-State Soil Fertility Specialist, Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Brian, Dorivar, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you, Shelby.
Gentlemen, this project you recently received $1 million to work on. And so, Dorivar, can you tell us a little bit about what is this project and this studying?
Yes, Shelby. This is a total project of $16 million in investment. Part of this funding is coming from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, about $7.7 million. And then key partners on this are Bayer Crop Science, Lycor, Lanscan, and K-State, providing additional investment for the total of $16 million. There's many partners, of course, in this project, and of course, it's a large project. One of the key objectives really here is to identify opportunities for synergy between management factors to improve yields and sustainability. These two key goals are usually a challenge for farmers because it's obviously affected by many components and things that we're doing in the field. And looking at that particular interaction require really large studies looking at multiple environments. They are complex studies, so really need that partnership working closely with the industry and obviously a very strong team of collaborators.
Kansas is obviously very variable, and so does this look at dry land and irrigated fields?
Yes, the number of locations that we'll have in this project in particular is going to be 8 locations, and it's covering large parts of the Midwest and the Great Plains. Some of the locations that we have are in Illinois, Minnesota, Mississippi, Nebraska, Ohio, Iowa, and then we have 2 locations in Kansas. You mentioned Kansas is variable, and it's really a great opportunity for us in Kansas to look at these more closely. And so we do have multiple locations, of course, and like I mentioned, a key partner here, Bayer Crop Science, is managing 5 of those locations. And so again, the complexity and size of this type of projects really require that partnership with the industry. Clearly, university alone are not able to do this type of projects.
And K-State isn't the only university that will be working on this.
No, it's a total of 5 universities. We are fortunate to have both K-State and KU actually involved in this project from Kansas. And then we have Iowa State, Mississippi State, and Ohio State as well.
And Brian, kind of what does the progression, or how do you hope to progress through this project?
Well, it is a true multi-state project where we're looking at different crop rotations. We're looking at different fertility, cover crop, tillage systems, and the goal there is to understand how these different factors are going to be impacting and driving production. But then as we look at that soil carbon and soil health component, by having this true multi-state region, we're going to be able to see how these different factors that are going to be the same across these locations are going to impact how soil carbon and soil health change. And this is going to be a very unique data set. This is something that, as we look across the data sets that are currently out there, you may see a couple locations within a state, but this is a true multi-state project. And so, again, I want to really thank Bayer Crop Science along with our other partners, but Bayer is a big part of this. And obviously, when we look at where we're going, we need to understand what that potential of soil carbon is out in the field. As farmers want to capitalize and be paid for sequestering carbon, we have to come up with good ways to understand how much carbon is actually being stored in there without going through there and continually taking soil samples. And this is really going to do that. The other part of this, as Dorivar and I have got into this, is understanding what is the dynamics of, like, say, a shallow water table, and understanding how that impacts soil health. So you got the microbial community out there. How's that driven by a shallow water table? So when we look across all of our sites that we are working on, we're going to be able to have a much better understanding of that in the end. And I think that's going to provide some big benefits for farmers in the future as we look at, obviously, changing what we're doing out there and sequestering more carbon and improving soil health.
So what will these tests look like in the field?
So these are larger tests. This isn't a typical 10 by 30 foot plot. In my previous position, I was with Bayer, and we set up the study, and it was about 15 acres. And then I went to some of the other locations at Bayer, and I thought, our study was pretty big, and it was actually 45 acres in some of the other locations. So we have really large plots. There's 144 plots out there typically at most of these sites. The plot size ranges anywhere from a little under a tenth of an acre up to a half an acre for these plots. And so, again, we've got really big plots out there that we're going to be able to see what happens with these crop production practices. And we're able to understand, what are the impacts of that crop rotation, and then also understanding how tillage and cover crop and that nitrogen application impact that carbon sequestration.
How long has this project been funded for?
This is also another unique component, Shelby. We're planning for our initial 5 years for this project, but there's really the intent to continue with this. As you know, many of these management factors really show up after multiple years, and that's been a challenge also from the funding standpoint. A lot of the funding has been more short term, and obviously we are not able to see this over time. Like Brian mentioned, there are some key components there on soil carbon and microbial diversity that takes time to measure and see the impacts. We're also measuring other key parameters like N2O emissions, which is a key component, of course. And another component that I'm really excited about this project as well is the modeling component, which will really allow us to use this data and give us the ability to provide some predictions in the future. And I think this is going to be really a key component to basically guide decisions in the future.
In a perfect world, if everything goes well for this project, kind of what will you get from it in the end?
A much better understanding. Again, back to the comments that I was talking about, look at soil carbon accumulation. If farmers really want to move forward with this, we have to have a better way than going out and measuring carbon out there in the field through taking soil samples. And so back to the modeling comment that Dorivar made, this multi-state study will feed into the modeling and will allow us to have much better insight in how much carbon in this situation is being sequestered. And then again, back to the soil health and microbial community, that's also going to provide some great information there. So it's going to be, in the long run, if everything works great, it's going to provide some great recommendations to farmers on their crop rotation, the cover crop, the tillage system they need to be using in order to sequester the carbon that is being needed or wanted by, let's say, entities out there that want to buy carbon credits from farmers.
Gentlemen, as you'll spend 5 years, and I'm sure a lot of time working towards this, what makes you excited to put in that effort?
Yes, I'm really excited for many reasons about this project. One of them, of course, is the knowledge gaps that we're going to be able to fill, basically, with Brian just mentioned. We also have a very strong team working in this project, and this is something that I'm really excited about it. Again, not just the university colleagues, but the possibility to work with industry. And this is, again, something very unique, and I really enjoy that aspect. We have access to resources that the industry is working on today. And again, in many cases may not be possible with university alone. And so that's one key component. I'm also very excited about the component that is focusing specifically in Kansas. We're looking at very contrasting environments here in Kansas, and I think it's going to give us some really specific information here for Kansas producers in particular.
Dorivar, Brian, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about this project you'll be working on.
Well, thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, and he was joined by the head of K-State's Western Kansas Research Extension Centers, Brian Olson. If you'd like to read more on this project that these two are working on, you can do so by reading a recent news released by K-State Research and Extension News titled K-State to Lead Multi-State Study to Improve Crop Production Practices. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to www.ksre.ksu.edu and on the left-hand side, clicking on News Stories. If you'd like to see more information from the Western Kansas Research Extension Centers, you can do so by going to www.wkarc.org. Again, that is wkarc.org. You can also check out more information from the Department of Agronomy here at K-State by going to www.agronomy.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Research shows that it is fairly common for cows to have udder edema at least once in their lifetime. This disorder is not caused by mastitis, but cows with udder edema do have an increased risk for development of mastitis. This week, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discusses some of the steps that can be taken to help reduce the incidence of udder edema in the herd.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning udder edema in our dairy herds. You know, as we think about udder edema, it's really a cow comfort issue that we're actually dealing with, and just wanted to share a few thoughts on some research that has recently been published, as well as how we might reduce the incidence of udder edema in our dairy herd. As you think about udder edema, obviously we're most concerned about first lactation animals. That's generally where we see that most commonly. However, it can occur in second lactation animals as well. Generally less of a problem as we get to further lactations. But when we look at udder edema, it really causes some issues with milking. A recent study looked at animals with and without udder edema. They did notice that there was an increase in the number of steps that animals took, as well as kicking during udder prep in the milking parlor. This will lead to our parlor being a little bit less efficient. Also is a bit of a danger issue possibly for our workers due to the increase in kicking. They also noted that there was a higher kickoff rate with animals that had udder edema versus those that did not, and that first lactation animals were more affected by this condition than second lactation animals. So when you think about udder edema, so why is it more of a problem with our heifers than older animals? Well, first off, udder edema is caused by a collection of the lymphatic fluid in the interstitial spaces. And when we think about heifers, there's several things that actually predispose them to the collection of this fluid in those spaces. So one is their mammary gland is rapidly developing, more so toward the end of their gestation than older animals. So there's an increased blood demand for this growth. The milk vein is not yet fully developed in heifers as it is in older animals, and as a result of that, it's more difficult for the lymphatic fluids to flow back, and this predisposes the animals to udder edema. Some other things that will increase the incidence of udder edema is age at first calving. As animals are older, when they first calve, they're more likely to develop udder edema. So trying to calve your heifers in at 22, 23, or 24 months of age will reduce the incidences of this in your first calving animals. Also, the length of the gestation leads to more issues with udder edema, so longer gestations. Nutritional management can also be a factor in that, as well as overconditioned animals and lack of exercise, particularly in the close-up area. So if you're having some issues with udder edema, the first thing we always check with is the amount of salt that we're feeding in our close-up period and making sure that we're not overfeeding salt there. One of the things you might check, if you have free choice salt available in the transition pen, we generally do not recommend that, but if you're going to be providing that pre-calving, use blocks, not loose salt. That will help control the consumption of salt just prior to calving. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a look at the incidence of udder edema in their herd. If they're having issues, visit with their nutritionist, as well as taking steps to prevent it.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.